January 8, 1999, Karura Forest, Nairobi. A group of women, most of them elderly, most of them poor, have come to plant trees on land that is being illegally seized by government officials. Today, armed men are waiting for them. The men beat them. They beat the women planting trees. They beat the journalists who came to document it. They beat the witnesses who came to help. The woman leading the group is knocked unconscious. She wakes up with blood on her face. She is taken to hospital. Her name is Wangari Maathai.
We're going to shed blood because of our land. We will. We are used to that.
She's a brilliant scientist and member of parliament. She's also, according to President Daniel Arap Moi, a madwoman. And in a way, he was not entirely wrong. Because what sane person keeps planting trees in a country where the government sends armed men to stop her? And what is it about the trees in Kenya that made her the most dangerous woman in the country? To understand why Wangari Maathai was in that forest, you need to understand what Kenya looks like before she started planting. Kenya's highlands, the fertile central region where she was born, were once covered in dense indigenous forest. Her people, the Kikuyu people, had lived in relationship with that land for generations. Then, the British arrived. The colonial administration declared the Central Highlands a white highland zone, meaning available for white settlement only. Kikuyu farmers were removed from their ancestral land and replaced by European tea and coffee plantations. When Kenya won independence from Britain in 1963, the new government inherited those plantation boundaries and in many cases kept them. The land changed hands from white colonists to black elites. But the ordinary Kikuyu farmers who had been displaced, they were still displaced. And the forests, the indigenous forests that had held the soil together, fed the rivers, sheltered the wildlife, continued to disappear, replaced by commercial monocultures, erased by illegal logging, cleared for development projects that benefited the politically connected. By the time Wangari Maathai came home from studying abroad in the 1960s, the land she had grown upon was being hollowed out. Rivers that had run clean were running brown. Women in rural villages were walking further and further for firewood. Children were going hungry because the soil could no longer hold crops. Nobody in power was treating this as a crisis. Wangari Maathai looked at all of it: the degraded land, the hungry families, the displaced communities, the disappearing forests, and she saw one thing clearly: the problems were connected, and the solution, when she found it, would be too. The woman who would eventually reclaim this land was born into the heart of it. On April 1st, 1940, in a small village in the Nyeri district, Wangari Maathai entered a world that was already being sold off piece by piece. Her father worked on a white settler's farm. Her mother planted crops on the family's small plot and told her children to stay in school. She was bright, unmistakably, inconveniently bright. She won a scholarship to study in the United States in 1960, part of the Kennedy Airlift, a program that brought hundreds of East African students to American universities. She arrived in Kansas in the middle of the American Civil Rights Movement. She watched the marches. She watched the Black Americans demand in public and at great personal cost the rights that the law had promised and withheld. It would leave a mark that never faded. She goes on to earn a master's degree from the University of Pittsburgh. She returns to Kenya, earns her doctorate from the University of Nairobi. In 1971, she becomes the first woman in East and Central Africa to earn a PhD. She's appointed chair of the Department of Veterinary Anatomy, the first woman to hold the chair at a Kenyan university. She is, by any measure, at the top of her field, and by the standards of Kenyan society in the 1970s, standards that had very clear ideas about what women were for, she is already far too much. In 1977, her husband, Wangari Maathai, files for divorce. He tells the court she's too educated, too strong-minded, and too hard to control for any man to manage. The judge grants the divorce, but she takes his name, slightly altered, and keeps it for the rest of her life. not as a tribute, but as a statement. Wangari Maathai. She had earned every syllable. The same year her marriage ends, she founds the Green Belt movement. Rural Kenyan women were struggling. The land was degraded. Firewood was scarce. Clean water was disappearing. Soil erosion was destroying crops and families were going hungry. Wangari Maathai's answer? Plant trees, not as an environmental campaign, but as an economic intervention. She went to rural women who had been told their whole lives that their role was to endure, not to decide, and she gave them seedlings and a wage. 10 shillings per tree that survived. A small amount, but enough to matter. A tree is just a tree until it gives a woman her own money. Then it is a revolution. The woman planted. The trees held the soil held the water fed the rivers fed the farms, and the woman had income. For the first time in many of their lives, this was money that was theirs. Word spread. The program spread. From Nairobi to the Rift Valley to the coast. By the 1980s, the Green Belt movement had tens of thousands of participants. By 1989, they had planted over 10 million trees. The government called it a women's project, meaning small, meaning not serious, meaning not a threat. They were wrong about all three. The Green Belt movement had started as an environmental program, but Wangari Maathai was beginning to understand that it couldn't stay one, because the same forces that were destroying the forests, corruption, land grabbing, unchecked government power, were also destroying the communities she was trying to rebuild. She was realizing that you couldn't protect trees without talking about land rights. You couldn't talk about land rights without talking about democracy. You couldn't talk about democracy in Kenya in the 1980s without making yourself a target. She talked about all of it. In 1989, President Daniel Arap Moi, whose government had been grabbing public land and handing it to political allies for years, announced the plan to build a 62-story skyscraper in Uhuru Park, Nairobi's largest public green space, a park that belonged to the people. The proposed building would include a 4-story statue of Moi himself. Wangari Maathai wrote letters. She held press conferences. She mobilized the Green Belt movement. She took the government to court. Moi's government called her a traitor, said a woman with no husband had no right to speak on matters of national importance. The state newspaper ran editorials dismissing her as a madwoman. She kept going. The international pressure became too great. Moi abandoned the project. Uhuru Park was saved. It would not be the last time she won. It would not be the last time they came for her. 1992, Kenya is under pressure from international donors and its own citizens to allow multi-party elections. Wangari Maathai is at the center of the pro-democracy movement, organizing, speaking, refusing to be quiet. The government arrests her twice. She is held without a charge. She is released both times because the international outcry is too loud to ignore. Mothers of political prisoners begin a hunger strike in Uhuru Park, the same park she had saved. They are demanding the release of their sons. Wangari Maathai joins them. Riot police move in. They tear gas the protesters. They beat the woman. Wangari Maathai is beaten unconscious. She is hospitalized and then goes back to the park. Moi calls her a madwoman again. His ministers mock her in parliament. They question her sanity, her femininity, her right to exist in public life at all. She keeps planting. And then comes Karura. January 1999, the government is now attempting to grab Karura Forest, 2,500 acres of protected urban forest on the edge of Nairobi, for private development. The beneficiaries are politically connected. The process is illegal. Wangari Maathai leads the Green Belt movement into the forest to plant trees. The men with machetes are waiting. Here is what the beatings and the arrests and the public mockery did not do. They did not stop her. They did not discredit her. They did not silence the Green Belt movement. They did not save one single tree that she had decided needed saving. The only thing they managed to do was to make sure the entire world was watching when she won. In 2002, Daniel Arap Moi's government falls. Kenya holds its first genuinely free elections. Wangari Maathai runs for parliament. She wins her seat with 98% of the vote. She is appointed Assistant Minister for Environment and Natural Resources. And then, on October 8, 2004, the Norwegian Nobel Committee makes its announcement. Wangari Maathai is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. She is the first African woman in history to receive it. The committee's citation is worth reading carefully. They do not give her the award for environmental activism. They give it for the indivisible connection she had spent 30 years proving between environmental sustainability, democracy, human rights, and peace. Oslo was a world away from the prison cells at Nairobi, but the message was the same. The madwoman was the only sane person in the room. She plants a tree in Uhuru Park when she receives the news. She is photographed in the soil, hands in the earth, the same way she has always been photographed. 51 million trees. That is how many the Green Belt movement has planted by the time she dies, grown from an idea that the government called subversion and the establishment called madness. Wangari Maathai died on September 25, 2011. Ovarian cancer. She was 71 years old. At her funeral, people held seedlings instead of flowers. She had asked them to. Now, here is what I'm asking you to hold. This is not a story about a woman who won a prize. The Nobel Peace Prize is the world's verdict on a life already lived. Is it inspiring? Yes, but it's not the story. The story is what she chose to do in the years before any institution recognized her, when the government was calling her a madwoman, when her husband was divorcing her in open court, when riot police were leaving her unconscious on the ground. She planted anyway. And what she planted, the movement, the language, the proof, is still growing. There is a version of Wangari Maathai's story that turns her into an inspiration poster. That version leaves out the government that beat her, the specific structural forces that made her work so difficult and yet so necessary. Her story is not about attitude. It is about power. Who has it? Who loses it? Who built it back with their bare hands, one tree at a time? She planted trees she knew she would never sit under. Now my question to you is, what are you planting? If her story moved you, I want you to go to the comments and type one thing that you are planting or hoping to plant. And if you want to see another woman who refused to stay in her lane, not in a forest, but on the grass courts of Wimbledon, check out Althea Gibson's story right here. Subscribe to Where She Stands, and I'll see you there.